Alors, on va la terminer. Peut-être, Lois, I don't know if you want to conclude, say something about termination, and then take some questions before leaving altogether at 5 o'clock. Thanks.
We made it. This is the end. So, I think that a more realistic attitude towards treatment than having just 1 year of intensive treatment and then never again is to really try to adjust the treatment to what is feasible at the time. So we advocate for just intervening so long as it's useful, and you may pause treatment so that the young person can take what they've learned and go out and use it. And you kind of assure them that they can come back in most cases and offer some sort of recontact when something happens. And not all situations will allow for this, but I find this really useful. And I think GPM lends itself as well to a more reasonable primary care approach to treatment. People with BPD have lifelong sensitivities. It's not a kind of one and done or cure and then it's over sort of situation. So you may set up regular appointments to follow up, whether it's a couple times a year or less. That will be determined by your situation in your clinic. But when you end, you'll find that the patients will mostly leave with anxiety because they're sensitive. They'll leave with mourning, sadness that it's over, but some appreciation. And they'll want to know that you'll still be there and that they'll still be important to you. So one of my first patients, who I had a very difficult time with, left treatment after 3 very intense years of struggling. Our first goal was to get her to shower once a week, and I thought she was schizophrenic at the time. She was so dysfunctional. She couldn't do anything. She wasn't working. She wasn't able to get out of bed. And by the time we graduated from treatment, she had a job and she was in school. And she said to me at the end, "You've helped me more than anyone else in my life, and my life still sucks." And I remember telling this to Peter Fonagy and Anthony Bateman, and I said, well, that was anticlimactic. But she was being honest with me. She went on to have these sensitivities, and life is always harder for her. But now she's a doctoral professional in mental health. So it's not that difficulties go away, but people will learn how to manage them over time. And the abandonment fears diminish before the intolerance of aloneness. So the more you build up your life and you feel like there's a reason to live and there's contributions you can make and you can have durable relationships, then you feel less anxious that people will leave you. And then lastly, from having a more durable relationship, especially with you in the treatment, they'll have a corrective experience that someone who can be reliable, supportive, but realistic can be there for them. And whatever tensions, conflicts, or problems occur in the relationship can be resolved if you kind of continuously lean in and help work out differences of opinion or misunderstanding. That's the difference between protecting someone from such conflicts and preparing them to learn how to manage them constructively. So at the end, you want to keep termination time limited. With a lot of patients, in traditional psychotherapeutic approaches, I remember I was taught to really make a big deal out of everything. Like termination starts like 3 months before the end. But this is actually something that really heightens fears for people with BPD, so we say more like 2 or 3 sessions. Keep it brief. And you want to work on this set of sessions and talk about what they've learned and what they'll use going on. And it helps to write these things down. And you want to encourage the development of independent living skills as a preparation for what's next and help them focus on what they want out of life. And most people will not need or want more than this kind of brief boost to help them get back on the road of life again. Some patients will continue to come back, but that is not everyone. So the process of change is to teach people that they're not alone, they're interpersonally vulnerable, but there's hope because they can manage this. You want to help them to think first, whether that's mentalizing and understanding themselves and others better in interaction, learn how to learn, and use these kind of capabilities to have a better experience of themselves and of relationships. They want to, if they can experience you as trustworthy and a role model that can admit to making mistakes and still be persevering enough to work out problems, that might reassure them that they can do the same. And then that will help them get a life of their own, and having a life that you can feel good about is an investment in having social capital or a sense of worth, something to contribute. So why do this work? A lot of you are at the beginning of your career. We all work hard to become the professionals we are so that we can address public health problems, and we want to do so in a cost-effective way. I think this generation is more concerned about kind of conserving resources and the public good, no offense to past generations. You also want to develop skills that will enable you to treat almost anyone. Having interpersonal skills, coping with the kind of intensities and the self-destructiveness of these patients will steady you to deal with almost any clinical situation. And that will provide your own personal growth. We harp on patients getting a job because having a life experience where you become something is reparative. So I've learned a lot of lessons where I had to change my mind or change myself to do my job. And that is something that we pass on to anybody, whether you have BPD or not, that facing life's challenges will help you learn about yourself and grow as a person. And you'll always have a deeply appreciated role in the patient and their family's life. And I think that's really important, is that I'll assure you from having survived many very complex and difficult situations that even the worst case scenario, there's something to gain. So having worked with families where their relative has died by suicide, you actually learn a lot about human survival, adaptation, mourning, adjustment, and moving on in life. And I think that's what's valuable, is that you gain hope in the human potential to go on living, despite what happens. So I hope you've learned a lot, and that you feel more capable or of managing patients with BPD, because you're going to have to. So if you have any questions, please let us know. I hope that you'll use what you learned today to just gain some experience, because we all learn over time. I still make mistakes, and every time something doesn't work, I learn something about what could work better or what we don't know about yet in the field. So thank you.
Merci. C'était pas en fait vraiment une question, mais plutôt une recommandation sur l'invalidation et la validation. Je vous recommande la vidéo It's Not About the Nail.
Ouais.
Je pense que certains d'entre vous peut-être la connaissent, qui
Ouais.
illustre aussi très bien et avec humour ce que peut être la validation et l'invalidation. Ouais.
Allez voir il est sur YouTube. It's not about the nail.
C'est une fille qui a un clou.
Ah non, on a dit, il faut pas le dire. Sinon, on perd
Je
l'effet.
révèle rien alors, je spoile pas. Voilà. Merci beaucoup en tout cas.
On la montre à combinaison familiale, effectivement, ça permet vraiment de faire l'expérience.
Je ne vais pas me monopoliser, mais j'ai deux autres questions. Bon, bah, c'est pas grave. Je vais essayer de parler fort. Simplement, pour savoir si vous partagez l'idée selon laquelle les scarifications n'étaient pas forcément, enfin je parle de la question à tout le monde, n'étaient pas forcément spécifiques du trouble de la personnalité borderline. Enfin, qu'on pouvait rencontrer aussi les scarifications dans d'autres cliniques. Est-ce que vous êtes d'accord avec ça ou pas?
Yeah. Globalement, oui. Même si c'est quelque chose qui est très fréquent dans les troubles de la personnalité borderline, on retrouve de scarification. Alors déjà, dans la population adolescente tout venante, le pourcentage de scarification est très élevé. La différence, c'est le nombre de scarifications, la durée, la permanence et le fait que ça devient un système un peu qui s'auto-entretient. Donc il y a une utilisation de scarification qui est assez générale chez les adolescents, mais qui ne se maintient pas dans le temps dans la plupart des sujets. Chez les patients présentant le borderline, c'est quelque chose qui s'installe de façon plus significative, mais il existe d'autres pathologies dans lesquelles c'est présent, que ce soit par exemple le trouble dépressif. Et puis c'est un comportement, c'est pas un soi, quelque chose qui est associé de façon spécifique à un trouble. Même si, en effet, c'est quelque chose qui est fréquemment retrouvé dans les troubles de la personnalité, parce que c'est quelque chose qui permet la régulation de l'expérience de soi, qui est un lien avec le fonctionnement borderline probablement. You want to add something?
About self-harm.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I would just add that, like Dr. Speranza said, that most people that self-harm will do so like maybe once or twice or just in an isolated phase, and they may not even have a diagnosis. So this is just something that happens at a phase of life where, you know, there's a lot of experimentation and impulsivity. But the same factors that tend to lead to self-harm lead to a variety of other disorders. So it generally involves some sort of family problems, sometimes social adversity like bullying, female gender actually, gender identity issues, trauma. So there's a number of psychosocial factors that increase likelihood that a young person will repeatedly self-harm. So those pathways will lead to a lot of different disorders, the most common of which is BPD. So the idea is that self-harm is a kind of hallmark of BPD. If your patient self-harms, you want to screen for BPD because it's likely that chances are they may have that disorder, and when you can detect it, you want to treat it. But not all people who self-harm will have BPD, but they'll probably have some other thing that needs treatment. And one thing that's commonly missed is psychosis. So there have been cases of people who have more bizarre ideation, like the devil is within me and he's telling me to self-harm, or they hear voices like there's a voice that says if I don't self-harm, X, Y, or Z will happen. You really do want to also not miss asking patients about kind of these positive symptoms of schizophrenia, because it's in that same age that a lot of different mental illnesses start to express themselves. So there are some very isolated cases that are schizophreniform or turning into a major psychotic disorder. And whatever it is, you want to support that person and keep following them and try to understand how their self-harm works over time.
Oui, merci beaucoup, mais on voit quand même dans les troubles de la personnalité limite beaucoup de symptômes psychotiques, et c'est qui ne signent absolument pas la schizophrénie, par ailleurs, pour autant. Enfin, je trouve la clinique
il y a des études, la littérature montre globalement que les patients borderline présentent beaucoup de symptômes psychotiques. Et c'est quelque chose qui justifie, dans la littérature récente, le fait de s'en occuper comme ça en occupe dans d'autres troubles, comme les troubles psychotiques. Donc, mais là, la question de la comorbidité est une question toujours complexe. On peut trouver, une chose sont des symptômes, une chose sont des syndromes qui s'organisent. Donc on peut retrouver en effet des hallucinations, d'ailleurs de tout type d'hallucinations dans les pathologies borderline qui ont été longtemps un peu sous-estimées et sous-diagnostiquées et sous-traitées. Donc ça peut aussi bénéficier en effet d'une action spécifique.
Moi, j'ai simplement des remerciements pour cette excellente journée. Je repars très enrichie, inspirée par toutes les présentations d'aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup. J'ai aussi une petite recommandation, vous l'avez déjà dit, que le livre, il est vraiment très, très, très excellent également. Donc je le recommande à tous ceux qui ne l'ont pas encore lu. Vous pouvez le lire en anglais pour la plupart, je pense, parce qu'il est assez accessible aussi pour les non-native speakers. Et si jamais vous voulez attendre la traduction, on y travaille à Lausanne, justement. Donc,
après l'été.
Oui, je pense qu'elle est prévue pour début de l'année prochaine.
D'accord.
Mais nous, on devra la faire même avant l'été.
Oui.
Merci.
Au revoir.
And I just want to say about the book, after John wrote the original handbook, we just felt like, he really made an effort to keep it simple. The original handbook is only 67 pages of actual text. And then people were asking me all the time, what does he mean by X, Y, and Z? So in the adolescent book, we explained everything more completely than in the handbook. And what we did was we asked Carla Sharp, who's the expert on personality development in adolescence, and a number of child psychiatrists who just primarily practice. A few of them are researchers, to help us build this book based on what they actually see in the clinic. So I think that really represents how grassroots it is it really is the experience of clinicians, what clinicians need to treat patients. They have tables you can share with the patient. There's quotes that you can use if you don't know what to say to the patient. And there's a lot of resources in the back. That's why the book is so much thicker. The publisher was actually a little bit unpleased with that, but it was to make sure that book was all you needed to start practicing, even for pediatricians who aren't psychiatrists.
Ma question, elle est pour le professeur Choi-Khan, du coup, en anglais ou en français?
I can, there's
Alright.
translation.
Je me demandais, vous avez mis le vide dans la sensibilité interpersonnelle. Est-ce que vous pourriez expliquer pourquoi et si ça a un intérêt du coup pour le traitement de le considérer dans l'hypersensibilité interpersonnelle?
This is a good question. So, in the interpersonal hypersensitivity model, the kind of changing states are dependent on the context. So when someone is getting fed in a way, like by their social environment, they have what's called their favorite person. This is new terminology. So do you have Reddit here? Reddit? Reddit. So I know a researcher, a young researcher at MIT, he did a kind of machine learning analysis of Reddit posts for different disorders. So there's a borderline personality disorder Reddit post, bipolar disorder Reddit post, depression Reddit post. And what he found distinguished the borderline posts was this phrase FP, favorite person. And it really illustrates this kind of phenomenon among people with BPD that they fixate on certain people in their lives. And then, a lot of times this is their therapist. And I think especially DBT, which doesn't incorporate the issues of transference or interpersonal kind of attachment issues into the treatment, I've seen a lot of very skilled therapists fall into this problem of attachment hyperactivation and increased preoccupation with the therapist themselves. And all of their kind of experience that enters their awareness, it's almost as if it depends on that person being there to help them metabolize and process it. Now, the problem is when inevitably that other person is not there. And it's almost like you lose your translator of what you understand in your physical experience to what you understand in your mental kind of sense. So what happens for people who experience BPD, they will often say that without the other person or a kind of container to themselves, they don't know what's going on within. They're lost. They don't have a way of understanding themselves, and that because they oftentimes look to the other person to provide them cues, direction, or reassurance. Now, the other kind of thing that I hear from people is that sometimes they are so used to this kind of external stimulation, sensation seeking. So whether it's with kind of daring behaviors, high-risk behaviors like driving fast or spending a lot of money or binge eating, they almost kind of produce an intense state of emotion that they can understand better. And sometimes lower, more normal levels of emotion doesn't register for them. So it's either an internal problem of understanding or being connected to oneself, or an interpersonal problem of not having someone there to help them kind of mentally understand their own experience. So that's how I think the interpersonal hypersensitivity model looks at it, because in that lower experience of despair, which is right under impulsivity, after the impulsivity fades, they're all alone at ground zero, and they are aware enough that they've produced enough destruction that that's all they see that represents them, and then they feel like completely empty, and that the only thing that they can understand about themselves is that they're ruinous or destructive, or that there's nothing to life. So that's when they're more seriously suicidal. So emptiness lives like somewhere between that impulsive state and that despairing state.
Thank you very much.
In relationship to this question, a lot of the difficulties of the borderline patients to understand what's going on inside feels similar to what autistic children will feel with understanding what's going on outside. Is there any evidence in research that there's a common neurobiological model or relationship between the two, or not?
Yeah, actually, right now we're writing a book called GPM for AUD and BPD. Our next book is GPM Autism plus BPD. We're going down the alphabet, coincidentally. But it's because a lot of programs have come to me, because I do a lot of consultation, and when I give talks, people ask me about the most difficult cases. I myself have experienced that autistic problems in the world of rigidity and more fixed difficulties with understanding social interactions, that is such a complex problem to have that it's more primary than BPD. If you have autism, your risk of having BPD symptoms is high. They have their own emotional dysregulation, and they have their own broader sensitivities. They're sensitive to a lot of things, people who have autism. But the difference is that people with BPD are actually more receptive to social information for understanding and locating themselves. Whereas people with autism actually become a little bit flooded and more irritated with social interaction. So what we're writing in this new kind of piece of work, and we actually put out an article on one case that talks about this, is that when you're working with patients who have autism and BPD, you don't want to do as much interpersonal work to help them regulate. People who have autism have their own wisdom of what helps them feel better, and they do what we call self-stimulation. It's like almost like self-harm. They'll like kind of massage their shins or do something that's like somewhat painful stimulus, and that will help them regulate their brain kind of activity. So we say that when you're working with autistic patients, you want to have shorter appointments, focus on different metaphors, like machines and something more systematized. That's what they're more interested in than things like nature or relationships. And you want to simplify the language because their kind of auditory learning mechanisms are not as strong as their visual learning mechanisms. So you do have to prioritize autism first when it is co-occurring with BPD, but the phenotype is quite similar. One person wrote, Frances Tustin is like a psychoanalyst, she had a really good description of how people with autism work in distinction of people who have BPD, is that people with BPD, it's like the other person completes them. You know, they're like fused with them and then they're kind of happy and comfortable. For the autistic person, the other person is like a plug in a hole. They're more like an inanimate object that becomes a tool for them. So they have less of a capacity to relate and deal with the emotional, interpersonal dynamics, but they sometimes very much need the other person because of their deficits. So it becomes more of like a kind of like a instrumental or dehumanized kind of accessory. It's a very interesting problem.
On va peut-être arrêter. Alors, à mon tour de remercier Lois Troyken, de remercier tous nos intervenants d'aujourd'hui, à nouveau Connexion Familiale, l'Institut Motorix Montsouris, nos traducteurs qui ont fait un travail très important et tous les techniciens qui ont participé à cette journée. Ceux qui seraient intéressés de continuer, Loris organise un colloque dans un mois à Boston, sous la GPM. Vous êtes invités, même si j'imagine que ce n'est pas facile d'organiser les choses pour y aller. Voilà, nous, certains d'entre nous, on sera à Boston justement pour continuer à créer ce réseau. Et alors peut-être Patrick Charbon qui anime le réseau francophone GPM produit une newsletter chaque année, aux 6 mois. Et donc il va pouvoir, si vous le souhaitez, être dans le mailing list qui vous permettra d'être au courant des activités GPM en Europe. Voilà. Merci à tous.